Energy. It fuels every part of our life, from the cars we drive and the life we live, to the myriad of devices we carry. Today's power landscape is a complex series of questions that few understand. Whether it's oil and other fossil fuels, or renewable energy like solar, wind, and tide, or the conversation of our lifetime, climate change. Two experienced voices keep you in the know and are now available to present their insights on energy issues impacting our lives. Bill Loveless is a 40-year energy journalist, with his stories appearing in both print and on television. In addition to a weekly column in America's newspaper, USA Today, he oversaw coverage of policy and regulation as editorial director with S&P Global Platts, a global provider of energy news and information. His CBS Washington television show, Platts Energy Week, kept Beltway insiders and Capitol Hill informed on matters that matter. Today, he is director of the Columbia University Energy Journalism Initiative and host of the Columbia Energy Exchange podcast. Veteran energy expert and thought leader Jay Hakes has served as the nation's top energy analyst, providing powerful guidance around the world, advising multiple presidential administrations, including Jimmy Carter, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. He has been a trusted voice of insight on Capitol Hill, testifying before Congress on 27 different occasions. And he was there as Director of Research and Policy for the BP Oil Spill Commission. In addition, he is the author of the prescient book, A Declaration of Energy Independence. Now, Bill Loveless and Jay Hakes have come together to present Energy Past, Present, Future. This powerful featured speaker series demystifies the complex questions facing energy and the world.
Jay, we've been following energy for a long, long time, and we're still very excited and very interested over following this topic because so much is happening. But think of how things have changed. When we began studying energy, looking at energy, reporting on energy back after the 1970s, in the 1970s, it was a very different era. It was a period of scarcity. We were running out of oil, it seemed. We were running out of gas, it seemed. There was fear. There had been gasoline lines. Where was this country headed? And here we are today with an abundance. We are producing record amounts of oil and natural gas and renewable energy in the United States. How things have changed.
Yeah, I mean, we now feel more secure about our oil posture because we've reduced net imports from 60% to 13%. We begin to see that there's some progress available for wind and solar, which we've kind of dreamed about for decades. And just in the last 12 years, we've seen a 14-fold increase in solar production. So that's good. And I do think now the next frontier is sort of dealing with the climate issue, which, as you well know, remains somewhat controversial. You probably run into people who say, this is the top national priority, let's do it tomorrow. And other people who say, this is being made up, there's no science that shows that man's changing the climate.
Yeah, no, I'm often asked by folks, they'll say, you're a reporter on this topic. What do you think of climate change? And I believe in the consensus of scientists around the world, from the preeminent universities, from the National Academy of Sciences, who say that climate change is occurring and that human beings are largely responsible for it. I accept that. And I think that's pretty much the view when you look out across certainly governments around the world. And industry and most people, but it's still important to that people understand what's happening and that this conversation is an informed one, and that doesn't always happen.
Right. They're contending voices, and I think that complexity always breeds misunderstanding. That's one reason that you and I have vowed to never use an acronym, and because the audience shouldn't be expected to know all of those acronyms. The science of climate change, for instance, is kind of complex in and of itself, and that's only one part of the energy puzzle. So, policy nerd that I am, I'm in the process of reading every White House and National Academy of Sciences report on climate change. The first major national White House report on climate change, a big substantive piece of work, 1965.
Wow.
The first major National Academy of Sciences study was 1975. And I think the science consensus pretty much reached by the late 1970s that no, the Earth was not cooling. The data showed it was warming, that we understood the chemistry of carbon dioxide. We sort of understood what the relationship was between the increased accumulations of carbon dioxide in the air and temperature rises. And again, this is kind of a little bit challenging for Americans because all the scientists talk about how much we're changing the Earth's temperatures in terms of centigrade. So they say, okay, we're headed towards 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. Well, that's 3.6 Fahrenheit. So, it's a little hard for those of us who write about it and talk about this. Should we talk about it in centigrade, which most of the science reports are, or should we talk about it in Fahrenheit, which is, so I try to do both. And not get too much into the gory details. But I do think this science is pretty solid, and it gives us a new challenge for energy. My book was on the challenge of getting energy independence. And when I wrote it in 2008, or it was published in 2008, I wrote it in 2007, it looked like it was going to be very hard to get to energy independence, and I was accused of being too Pollyannish. And then here we are, with these sort of wonderful reversals in trend. So the next challenge is the climate change challenge, and I think that can be done in ways that are consistent with helping our national security, helping our economy, and obviously helping the environment.
Yeah, and we did see things change so quickly because it was around that time that your book came out that the shale revolution took place in this country.
Right.
Something that it seems no one had really foreseen. Well, you kind of foresaw the potential for that sort of thing in your book. But now with these record amounts of natural gas that we're producing, that's certainly helping and to minimize the carbon emissions in the United States and other parts of the world. Technology really can surprise us sometimes, and it takes time for it to sort of mature and to reach a point where it can make a difference. The shale and horizontal drilling that gave rise to the shale boom in this country really began back in the 1970s with some government assistance. But it was only, some 30, 40 years later that it really began to have an impact. So you never know where some of this technology might go. And the climate change issue is certainly a difficult one. It's a concerning one. There's a lot of risk associated with it. But I think we need to keep in mind, too, there's a lot of potential to address this effectively, especially if you let innovation occur. And we see that. We've seen the developments that have taken place in solar energy. We begin to see it in things like and energy storage, which still has a way to go to be truly commercially available on a widespread basis, but it's getting there. And so I think that if you allow innovation to bloom and to take off, there's I think there's a lot of solutions there. How quickly it addresses these concerns, I don't know. It may be some time before we know that, but there's I think you can look at it not so dourly.
Yeah. Well, I know you have put special attention on technology over the years, and I've tried to do that as well. I think whether you're talking about energy independence or you're talking about dealing with climate change, there's a commonality, and that is how fast can we push technology. And so we want to push technology with research and development. We want to produce it with entrepreneurial successes in finding new technologies and refining them for the market. And all of those play a role. You know, on the fracking side of it, as a historian, I'm probably more aware than most people, but there was a plan back in the early 90s to get to the shale oil, and it was having nuclear devices that would go down and explode it. And the assumption was that people wouldn't mind getting natural gas in their house if it was only a little bit contaminated.
Thank good that technology didn't take hold.
So actually, I think it was either 1999 or 2000, I went out to George Mitchell's first commercially successful fracked well. So I was aware of the technology, and my first reaction was, we can do this with water rather than with nuclear explosions. But you know, I do think things can change pretty rapidly. I think it is a challenge for people because a lot of people, me included, kind of like to do things the way we've been doing them. But on the other hand, you know, I'm looking forward to my first electric car. I've ridden some of my friends' electric cars, and so it's kind of exciting what's out there. And I do think there's a lot of win-win situations. In my book, I talked about there were some policies that were so good that they could deal with the national security, the economy, and the environment. And I called these threefers. Some things were twofers because they could deal with two of them, and sometimes they kind of collide. But that's kind of what I think we're looking for, is finding and making the right choices. That's why I think we need to make steps as we go along, realize that you don't do it all in one fell swoop, because we'll probably learn some things that we didn't know. But we can also make educated estimates of what's going to work and what's not going to work. You know, I don't think that's asking too much. And so there's a lot of things right now that can be done, and frankly, in many cases, are being done.
Right, right. Well, being a creature of Washington, and I've spent most of my career there since 1980, covering energy policy, regulation, energy business. You know, I can't help but keep track of what's going on there. And the big event right now is the Green New Deal. People are, it's attracting so much in the way of headlines these days. It's something that young people are particularly interested in. It's not well defined right now, but I think it's having a big impact on how this discussion is taking place, and including what should be the role of government. And I think it's going to be a while before we see how this plays out. I don't see, there's a lot of questions right now, and we're at really the very beginning of the process. But I think without a doubt, this topic is going to be one that's going to be in the air for the next 2 years, certainly leading up to the next presidential election.
Right. You know, I don't think anybody can accuse the Congress of moving too fast on this issue. You know, one thing even, you know, we're talking about energy, but one thing that everybody in the world of energy needs to understand is that it only takes 41 votes to keep a filibuster going in the Senate. So, you know, something happening there overnight isn't going to occur. But I do think that there are realistic ways, and I think many of the industries that in the past have resisted regulation now, if the regulation is viewed as reasonable, want to participate in leading to a greener future. And you know, this again is something that is controversial right now, but you know, there's what are we going to do about the automobile efficiency standards? There's some pretty bold goals out there. And the industry's position is we need to slow down a little bit, but not too much. And then there's another group that says, well, let's kind of scrap this and we've done as much as we can. And then there's another group that says we need to do more. I do think if you look at all of the technologies that are available for the automobile that haven't even had to be used yet, I think there's a lot of upside potential. And this is something, you know, our culture is dependent on the car in many ways. After the Arab oil embargo in 1973, Time magazine at the end of the year had a picture of a car on the cover to look like a human face. And it was one of these big cars with the fins on it, and the tears were coming out of the eyes of the car because people said, well, the traditional car isn't going to work anymore. Well, the big cars with the big fins and everything did disappear, but the car bounced back strong, you know, and people like cars, and that's part of our culture. But if you're driving an electric car that's powered by wind and solar energy and maybe a nuclear plant and maybe sequestered natural gas, you can have your cake and eat it too. It's just how do we get to that point in a reasonable way that doesn't scare too many people, but is fast enough to make a difference and keep climate from spinning further out of control.
Right. One thing I find interesting right now is for all the talk, and it's legitimate talk, about there being these great divides in Washington between Republicans and Democrats, left and right, and all that sort of thing. I do see lately a convergence, to some extent, not a great deal, but to some extent, of interest on among Republicans and Democrats on topics like carbon capture and sequestration and nuclear energy. I mean, no doubt nuclear energy is taking a beating to some extent in this country as old plants have shut down and only one big one is under construction these days. But there's more talk about, we got to save the nuclear plants we have, and we need nuclear going forward if we're truly serious about low carbon or no carbon electric power generation. And so therefore, I interviewed Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, the other day for the Columbia Energy Exchange podcast. And he is a co-sponsor of that legislation, along with, Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma and John Barrasso of Wyoming. Normally, you wouldn't see these guys as being partners on much of anything, but they are on these issues. The Union of Concerned Scientists, often a critic of nuclear energy lately, has been saying, we really need to try to save these existing nuclear power plants if they operate well, because we're going to need them going forward. So, I think there's room to maneuver in there going forward politically, and that's going to be an important part of the public discussion and people's understanding of these issues, so they can continue to support their legislators on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think in the past there's been a conflict that, in my mind, has not been necessary. The environmental groups have, many of them have tended to be very anti-nuclear. And as you know, I worked for a while for Jimmy Carter, who worked with Admiral Rickover as developing the nuclear navy. And Jimmy Carter's view always was that nuclear power could be produced safely. And I do believe that. When I was working on the Oil Spill Commission, we actually brought in a number of the nuclear experts to talk to some of the offshore drilling companies, because the nuclear industry had a good understanding of risk and how to prevent accidents. And on the other hand, the nuclear industry has been somewhat hesitant to tie itself to the climate science. So this was sort of an unconsummated marriage. But now there may be more hope on that. And, I think we look at climate and we see the rising sea levels on the coast, but it's not just a coastal problem. One of the predictions of scientists in the 1970s was it was going to change where agricultural land was located. Now, warming might actually be good in some climates, might actually increase agricultural production, and in other areas it's going to be devastating to agriculture because of the dehydration of soils. Now, you can sit back and say, well, it's a net wash. Well, it would be a net wash if everybody could just up and move their farm, 200 miles every once in a while. So everybody's kind of in the same boat, brother. Yeah. And so I think that may lead to the kind of bipartisanship that you've run into in some of your recent debates that might not have been there before.
Right. And looking at states, what the states are doing. The states are great laboratories of policy and regulation, and we see a lot of innovation occurring, not only on the coast in New York and California, where there's pretty ambitious programs underway, but even in the middle of the country. Certainly, you could look to Texas as a country now, not only one of the leaders in oil and gas production, but also in renewable energy and wind power in particular. In a number of other states, where wind power in the Plain states, where wind power has so much potential. And those states are adapting to that and trying to respond to how they can provide for the economic development in their regions, as well as for energy security. So the state policies are important to consider too, and I think that's something that's often overlooked.
Yeah, the first state to adopt a renewable portfolio standard was Iowa, and I think Texas may have been second or third. And so the three great wind-producing states in the United States are Texas, Oklahoma, and Iowa, which are not, what we call deep blue states. And so this idea that renewable energy has a place is pretty widespread across different ideologies and viewpoints. And the test of the pudding is when you do 10% or you do 20%, how does the grid work? And so far, those problems have worked out pretty well. And to sort of double back a little bit on the nuclear argument, we have lost some nuclear plants in recent years, but we're still getting about 20% of our electricity from nuclear. And you say, well, how can that be? We've lost plants and it's still 20%. Well, the answer is the plants that are remaining are more efficient, and they're not don't have as much downtime. In some cases, they've made little tweaks to produce more power. So, I think that's going to have to be part of the mix too. And people can't just get wedded to one solution. I think the different solutions are going to have to kind of work together and see that they each have a role. And I think when there's not that recognition, it makes it harder to solve the problem technologically, and it's also harder to solve the problem politically. Right. And it has to kind of be solved both ways. It has to be solved with technical innovation, and it has to be done with some creative policy making within the political arena.
Yeah, and again we get back to that innovation. I have to admit that for some years I had sort of had begun to discard in terms of my consideration of energy nuclear power. I mean, it was there, we had it there, but I just thought it was that the nuclear renaissance that they were predicting some 12 years or so ago was not going to happen. The plants were too expensive to build. That was first and foremost was going to be the problem, and you had the waste issues and all of that. I've sort of come around on this now. I'm sort of sold on the view that there is some potentially promising technology out there for nuclear energy, advanced technologies, particularly small modular reactors, ones you can build in components in a factory and deliver to a site depending on the size plant you need there. And with sort of waste containment technology and all, that'll make the disposition of the waste later much easier to deal with. And one project in particular is one by a company called NuScale in Oregon, where they've actually going through the nuclear regulatory process. They have a site in Idaho. They have apparently a buyer for some of the power that would come out of it. So I'm beginning to think, there could be some, nuclear may be able to make a comeback in this country, but on a different basis. Heck, even Bill Gates is one of the big advocates putting some money in some of this nuclear technology. So it's not a technology you necessarily want to give up on just yet.
Yeah, well, you can interject at almost any time in an energy discussion the question, what about China? And we're in a situation here where electricity is not particularly growing. It's rising, if at all, less than population growth. So there may not be a need here for the big 1,000-megawatt nuclear plant, and if we use them, it would probably be the smaller ones you're talking about. But in China, they don't have access to natural gas like we do. They do have gas in the one end of the country, but it's not a highly populated area, so it's been a little bit hard for them to deal with. They're a little undecided when about the wisdom of importing gas from the Soviet or from Russia. When I was over there, I said to one of the generals, I said, well, you could import gas from Russia. And he said, we will never do that. But now maybe they will. But you have to look at all these things. Climate change is one of our first global environmental issues. Emissions in one country affect climate all over the world. So that's another reason to keep the nuclear option alive is even if we didn't need it here, and we may need it here, we're going to need it abroad. And that's why the last few days I've read that one of the things the nuclear industry is asking of the government is assistance in marketing abroad. And you might say, well, why are we interested in that? Well, just as China is affected by our emissions, we're affected by their emissions. So we do need to have partnerships. And I think, again, if I went back 8 or 9 years ago, I think we're much further along in working with China on issues like this than I would have predicted we would be. And I happened to go over there just as that was starting to change. And one little experience. It's a little different dealing with the Chinese. I was actually speaking to the largest communist party at the provincial level in the country, and it's that province would be probably in the top 12 economies of the world if it was a separate country. So in the morning, I gave a talk. It was a long talk, and I suggested, well, we needed new technologies like LED light bulbs. That would really reduce our dependence on electricity, and so they kind of nodded. So then when it was over, they said, well, we want you to hold a press conference with the governor in the afternoon. I said, oh, okay, I'm up for that. So the governor gets up. We have our translators there, and we're sitting in these high back chairs, and he says, we need to move to LED lights. And I nodded, and we talked about that for a while. And I thought at the time he's really concerned about climate change. Well, later I figured out that province wanted to manufacture the LED light bulbs that might be imported here. So, there's always this economic interest that's bound up. But I think you do want to be on the advanced curve of technology and not trailing the pack.
Right. Well, speaking of the nuclear energy and all, and what part it might play in the grid, I think another important issue these days is what will be the makeup of our grid going forward in the United States. Distributed energy where people can produce power on a small scale basis here and there, rooftop solar, that sort of thing, mini grids are certainly beginning to have some impact we're seeing in different parts of the country. That is likely to increase as time goes on. People's expectations of energy, how they use energy and what sort of energy they want. A lot of people want green energy. Is also going to be a factor in deciding how electricity is produced in this country. A lot of it will be driven by algorithms and big data. It already is, but to a much greater extent. And so and then there's a question of reliability. How reliable will all of this be, and how resilient will it be to hacking and these sorts of things? These are issues that are beginning to enter the conversation much more right now. And, the grid is very reliable right now. I mean, if you talk to most producers or most grid operators, they'll tell you it's reliable by a factor of 99.99%. Of course, you don't have that small little potential risk there if your internet goes down is a problem. But by and large, it's a reliable grid, and the studies show this. But nevertheless, as the grid changes fundamentally, will it continue to be that reliable going forward? When you go to flick your lights or turn on your TV or turn on your internet, will you be able to count on it as much as you have right now? I think you will, but those questions are arising more and more these days as the technology changes that much more.
Yeah, we're getting more demanding of our grid. Do you realize how frustrating it is when I'm writing you an email and my computer crashes? And I think it's an investment, because if you look at what small outages in electric supply do to the productivity, they're huge. So, part of developing vibrant systems is the willingness to invest and invest in infrastructure. And we live in the society we live in because somebody at some point built an interstate highway, and they built electric transmission lines and things like that. And we need to keep the investment going, and a secure grid is certainly something that's good for our country.
Yeah, and it's a matter of who is going to pay for it, and whether it will continue to be paid for in the same way that it has been in the past by big utilities or whatever. But all of these, this is why this topic is so, it remains such a compelling one, because it does affect everybody, but it is undergoing so much change. And in a way, it's a great news story for us in this country, because we see all the advances that have taken place in various forms of energy. But at the same time, there are new challenges and a lot of uncertainty of how we address that, the climate being probably the most obvious one. But there's no doubt that this is an issue that will continue to be one that affects everybody in very, very significant ways. And it will provide a new sort of energy context, I think, for everyone that's different from what we saw 5, 10, 15, even 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I'm going to talk with you afterwards because you raised the question of who's going to pay for it, and I'm sure you have a solution to that. But maybe we should just wrap up and pat ourselves on the back because we just talked about one of the most complex issues in the world, and we didn't use a single acronym.